Thank you all for joining us for today's Badger Dairy Insight meeting. My name is Heather Slusser, Agriculture Extension Educator in Marathon County, and I'm your moderator for the day. Today, we have several speakers that are going to speak with us about the main topic of managing our heifers' maturity pre and post breeding. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please place them in the chat box below. Our first speaker is Megan Lauber. Megan is currently a graduate research assistant in dairy reproductive physiology under Dr. Paul Fricke in the UW-Madison Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences. Her research focuses on optimizing the fertility of sex semen in lactating dairy cows and heifers and implementing precision management. Thus far, Megan has authored or co-authored 14 abstracts and publications related to various aspects of reproduction and has been recognized as a 2019 Dairy Cattle Reproductive Council Scholar. Megan grew up on a 60-cow registered Holstein dairy farm and has a passion of working with dairy cattle and science. Her goal is to find solutions for farmers that can be implemented into their reproductive management strategies to improve animal health, productivity, and their profitability. Welcome to today's presentation, Megan. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Heather, for that introduction. And thank you again to UW Extension for the opportunity to present some interesting data. So today I'll be presenting some data that we have, weight, how defining breeding eligibility of heifers impacts first lactation milk production. If we think about the heifer development, we can kind of think of this as a timeline. We have that heifer calf, she's born, she begins to again go through this time period of growth and development, begins to mature as a heifer, and we're in this non-lactating state. That heifer, we're hoping that she achieves puberty at about 9 months of age, and hopefully that we have conception about 14 months of age. And so with this, we're hoping for an age at first calving at about 23 to 24 months of age to go from this non-lactating, non-productive state into her first lactation, where we're in a productive state, working towards paying herself back in that large investment we initiated as a heifer. And we're hoping then that once she's calved, that she'll continue to calve on, go into her second lactation, and continue on calving and being a very productive member of our herd. And so when we talk about this timeline and looking at things, we mentioned different parameters, different time elements, but I think we also have to mention some aspects relative to maturity. And one important thing relative to maturity is talking about what's mature body weight. What is mature body weight? This is the weight of our third lactation cows or greater. And for Holstein cows, this can be defined on average about 1,500 pounds. What I'll note here, though, is this can be different based on the herd. We have some herds that may have slightly smaller cows, so this value might be slightly less, maybe compared to another herd where they breed for larger cows, where this can be slightly more. So this can be very herd dependent, but for instance, today, let's just say on average, this could be about 1,500 pounds. And what I want to note as well is that, this isn't the weight of those cows that are leaving the herd, having a career change. You can't look at this and get this from your cull check. This is really going out, looking at your third lactation or greater cows that are staying in the herd, that are being productive, and getting an idea of what they weigh based on that. And with this, to get this to this benchmark of this time, it's been suggested that this average daily gain should be close to about 1.8 pounds per day. And so this, again, can be potentially a lofty goal for our herds, depending on the environment and, whether if we're actually truly really measuring what our heifers are actually growing towards and actually having an idea of what that could be. But, with this 1.8 pounds per day, for these heifers, this is hopefully to allow us to achieve our benchmarks of inseminating at about 55% of this mature body weight. So if we think of this as this 55% relative to what we say is our mature body weight, for instance, this 1,500 pounds, this Holstein heifer should be about 825 pounds at the time that we inseminate her. So again, including some of these maturity aspects into this heifer growth timeline when we think about the timeline of this heifer and how she stays in our herd and her productive life. And so with that 55% mature body weight, after she's been inseminated, she becomes pregnant. that heifer will continue to grow. And once she calves in, we're hoping that heifer calves in, does well, and that post-calving, or as Paul likes to say, decaffeinated, we're hoping that she's at about 85% mature body weight. That's one of our other key benchmarks. So that 85% relative to that 1,500 pounds would have our first lactation cows at about 30 days of milk, just over 1,275 pounds. And as many of you are aware, heifer rearing is costly. So for us to get this heifer from this non-productive state, non-lactating and grow developer to where she calves in and becomes a productive member of the herd, this from data that from our own UW extension here, from survey data from 2015, as well as those at Cornell from 2019, have found that this value on average costs about $2,500, including that value of the calf. And with this, the major contributor of that total cost is feed, with feed accounting for about 50% of the total rearing costs. So raising heifers is truly an investment, and it's a very costly one. And so with this, we've seen a lot of herds shift gears to try to decrease that age at first calving to mitigate the costs that they see in raising these replacements. So with this, we've had the average age at first calving decrease here in the United States. It's been recently reported that the average is about 24.5 months. This was back in 2017. Maybe with survey data from now in 2022, that might be even less. We're starting to see a lot of herds try to calve in at 22 months of age, for instance, as an average. But it's interesting with this, though, we see that the greatest economic return, though, is associated with an age at first calving of 23 to 24 months of age. And with this as well, we're starting to see more data presented that there may be an effect of rather than age, but potentially this weight, that we're seeing a greater impact on the first lactation milk production rather than age itself. So our objective with the observational data I'm going to present here was to determine the association between weight versus age at first calving on milk production in pounds per day of Holstein cows during their first lactation. So a brief breakdown of what we actually did for the data analysis. So what we did is we took data and extracted it from dairy comp files from a Holstein herd just milking over 6,600 cows. Breeding age heifers were inseminated primarily on age, even though this weight data was here, which is very interesting. But heifers with a gestation length less than 250 days or greater than 300 days were removed from the analysis. So we're only looking at heifers that have a normal calving interval, that they weren't forced to have a shorter gestation period or have a reduced age at first calving because of a shorter gestation length. The percent mature body weight was determined by weighing those third and fourth lactation cows at about 30 to 40 days of milk, and that the first lactation cows were grouped based on weight at 30 days of milk and grouped into quartiles based on body weight, or 4 equal groups. So if we dive into this data, first kind of the way we looked at this was creating weight quartiles by age at first calving. So here we looked at the age at first calving of the first lactation cows, where they're either 21 months of age, 22 months of age, or greater than or equal to 23 months of age. And what we did is we created weight groups, or quartiles, 4 even groups based on this weight. So those in this first quartile, quartile 1, were those that were our lightest weight first lactation cows, just over 1,000 pounds to 1,100 pounds. Those in our second quartile were our second lightest weight first lactation cows, anywhere from 1,100 pounds to just over 1,200 pounds. Those in this third quartile were our second heaviest first lactation cows, so almost 1,300 pounds. To those in this fourth quartile, which were our heaviest first lactation cows, which were closer to about 1,400 pounds in these age groups of 21, 22, or greater than or equal to 23 months of age. And so with that as well, as I mentioned before, this mature body weight, seeing what that is relative to what we have of these first lactation cows, this herd was able to weigh about 75 third plus lactation cows that were about 30 to 40 days of milk. And so the average mature body weight for this herd was 1,510 pounds. And so with this, we're actually able as well to look at, are these first lactation cows achieving their mature body weight based on these quartiles? And what's interesting it's really only those in these third and fourth quartiles that are actually reaching this benchmark of closer to 85% mature body weight post calving. And so that's regardless of age as well at first calving. And so here, if we look at the relationship between age at first calving and weight quartile on milk production, this is for week 12 milk production. On the y-axis, we have our milk production in pounds per day. On the x-axis, we have our age at first calving, either 21 months of age, 22, or again, greater than or equal to 23 months of age. And then again, within, we have our weight quartiles. Quartile 1 here in the orange is those that are lightest weight first lactation cows, with those again in the green are heaviest first lactation cows. And what's really interesting about this data set is that regardless of age, whether it's 21, 22, or greater than or equal to 23 months of age, we see that those in this fourth quartile that are calving in heavier as first lactation cows have greater milk production than those that calve in this lightest weight quartile during their first lactation. And this is about 11 to a 12 pound spread per cow per day, regardless of age. So it's really interesting that, weight seems to be the bigger impact here rather than age, where we can have these first lactation cows calve in at 21 months of age and still achieve great milk production. Whereas again, it's this weight rather than this age. It's not like we have only those producing very highly in this greater than 23 months of age. We see that at each age, we can have this milk production, but it's based on this weight. And again, if we look at this in a different aspect, here we have relationship between age at first calving and milk production at week 4, 8, and 12. So again, on the y-axis is milk production. On the X is week, either 4, 8, or 12. The purple is 21 months of age at first calving, light gray is 22, and the dark gray is greater than or equal to 23. And again, when we don't have these weight quartiles, you can still see that there's really no difference based on age at first calving, whether it's for week 4, week 8, or week 12 milk production. And it's getting back to that this is an aspect of weight and growth rather than age. So with this information, we wanted to take and relook at this data set. And so instead of breaking it out by age and then creating weight quartiles within each age, we just wanted to use the whole data set and create quartiles or these groups solely based on their weight. So again, quartile 1 is those that are lightest weight first lactation cows, just over 1,100 pounds, versus those, for example, in this fourth quartile, these are heaviest first lactation cows, just over 1,400 pounds. And with this as well, we have that percent mature body weight, that benchmarking I was telling you before. And again, it's super interesting. We only have really these third and fourth quartiles really achieving that 85% mature body weight benchmark post-calving that I mentioned before. And again, reiterating that we can have different ages and still get these milk productions. There's really no difference in these groups between age at first calving, with the majority of them calving at about 22 months of age. And I think another interesting aspect Paul and I have kind of talked about, and we really felt that we should include, is how potentially genetics could play into this. So with this herd, unfortunately, we didn't have genomic data available, but we did have actually sire predicted transmitting abilities, or PTA values. So again, here we have our weight quartiles, either quartile 1, again, those lightest weight first lactation cows, all the way up to quartile 4, those that are heaviest first lactation cows, as well as these different sire PTAs. So if we kind of focus first on milk, it's interesting, actually, these in our first quartile have a slightly lower average PTA for milk production compared to those in our fourth quartile, which have a greater milk production, predicted transmitting ability in pounds of milk compared to those in our first quartile. But it's interesting, this seems to kind of be confounded because if we look at some of these growth parameters, such as stature, it's interesting, those in this first quartile are actually being selected for to be smaller cows than those in this fourth quartile who are being selected to be slightly larger cows. It's actually cut in half. In addition, kind of looking at this from a feed efficiency aspect, we see that those in this first quartile are actually being selected for to be more feed efficient saving more pounds of feed based on this feed save trait on average versus those in this fourth quartile, where we're really not having as feed efficient cows. And again, this kind of goes back to the milk production being selected, but also, again, some of those other size parameters of having also a slightly larger cow. So that's interesting, as well as this productive life. So productive life, looking at this, these heifers in this first quartile on average have a greater productive life compared to those in this fourth quartile, which are slightly lower. And, you know, for Paul and I, as I work with Dr. Fricke, kind of the really interesting part for us as reproductive physiologists is these fertility traits. So looking at daughter pregnancy rate and heifer conception rate. And so it's interesting when you focus on these fertility traits, those in this first quartile based again on DPR and heifer conception rate, these on average are more fertile animals, fertile first lactation cows compared to those in this fourth quartile, where we see that even here, for example, heifer conception rate, this is a negative value on average compared to our first quartile. So what does this actually relate to what we actually see on this herd or phenotypically? So here we have our pregnancies per eye for these first lactation cows when they were heifers at their first service. So here on the y-axis is our pregnancies per eye as a percent. And on the X, we have our quartile groups. Again, similar color scheme. What's really interesting is we see that those genetic PTAs that I showed you before, especially with fertility, are being observed in the phenotypic values here with our fertility. So for example, here, those in this first quartile, those lightest first lactation cows, about 71% of them on average are conceiving at the first service, compared to those in this fourth quartile where 46% of those are conceiving at the first service. So kind of what does this mean? It's really interesting. These heifers in their first quartile are almost kind of penalized themselves because they became pregnant at the first service because of their genetic value. Because they became pregnant at the first service, they had less time to grow compared to those in this fourth quartile where they were less fertile. It took multiple services for them to become pregnant. But because it took multiple services for these fourth quartile heifers, they had more time in that breeding pen, more time to grow compared to those in this first quartile, which seems to really, again, getting back to that growth and having that appropriate size, seems to very much impact first lactation milk production. And so if we look at this final relationship between weight quartile and milk production, we'll look at this for weeks 4, 8, and 12. It's that similar trend, again, when I broke it out based on, you know, these ages within quartiles. So here on the y-axis, we have milk production in pounds. On the X, we have these weeks at 4, 8, and 12. Similar groups again, the similar quartiles, similar color scheme. It's really interesting across weeks, you see that those calving in at a lighter weight at 30 days of milk in their first lactation have lower milk production at 67 pounds per cow per day at this time point, compared to those calving in heavier at 79 pounds per cow per day at week 4. And again, across these weeks, it's about 11 to a 12 pound spread per cow per day, whether they calved in a lighter weight quartile versus calving in at this heaviest weight quartile. So that's quite a bit of milk production potentially being left on the table and kind of penalizing those heifers and not allowing them to potentially reach their full genetic potential for these heifers. So in conclusion, increased weight at 30 days of milk relative to percent mature body weight rather than age at first calving was associated with increased milk production at 4, 8, and 12 weeks in first lactation Holstein cows. And it's really interesting that the genetic merit for fertility was associated with the pregnancies per eye at first service. And then from that, the subsequent weight after calving and how that affects production. But it's interesting, and I think it's really merited that we need further studies to kind of better understand these associations between genetic merit of heifers and their subsequent production and performance, as well as, you know, with this herd, it would have been nice to have potential incidences of disease of these heifers, such as scours and pneumonia, to kind of see how that really actually impacts production as well. When I present this data set, kind of one of the big questions I get from a lot of producers, veterinarians is, you know, do heifers ever catch up? we like to play catch up in our daily aspects all the time. We kind of put things off. We'll say we'll catch up on that on the weekend. We'll devote that time and do it later. And kind of the question I get is, can heifers do that? Can we push it off later and just catch up and get that milk production later on in subsequent lactations? So with this herd, I was able to pull out some lactation curves. This first graph here is from Dairy Comp, plotting the average weekly milk production on the y-axis, with the weeks here on the x. This is by age at first calving, where you see the green, dark green is those that are calving in at 21 months of age. The purple is 22 months of age. The light green is 23, and the yellow is 24. And with this, you can kind of see that there's a difference in milk production. It looks potentially based on this age, but with what I presented here, we know that age really doesn't seem to be the limiting factor, and it's more of weight. But with this herd, we're actually able to look at this from a weight aspect because this is being recorded in Dairy Comp, which, depending on what the herd you're working with, that data might not be available. But so we can actually look at this based on weight and see that this spread, again, like I presented to you further, is actually larger and based more on weight rather than age. So again, similar axes, but this time this is plotting it based on their weight group, based on their weight in their first lactation at 30 days of milk. How they denoted this in their Dairy Comp is weight group 10. These are our lightest first lactation cows. Those are in the blue, which would be that quartile 1, which I showed you before. The dark green is those calving in that quartile 2, second lightest. Purple here, second heaviest, that quartile 3. And finally, that 13 is in our lime green. That's our quartile 4, or heaviest first lactation cows. And like I showed you guys before in those graphics here, substantial spread in the milk production per cow per day between those calving in this heaviest weight group during their first lactation versus those that are calving in their lightest weight. And so this isn't surprising, right, based on what I presented before, because this is during their first lactation. But let's go ahead, let's have them calve in. Let's look at their second lactation. So again, similar axes, same colors, same groups. But what's interesting, again, we're looking at these weight groups based on their first lactation, but now we're looking at their second lactation milk production. And similar to their first lactation, those calving heavier here during their first lactation at 30 days of milk compared to those that calved in lighter at 30 days of milk have greater milk production, not only in the first lactation, but also in their second lactation, and by quite a bit. And the question is, okay, well, what about their third lactation once they reach that mature state? And it's a similar story. Again, same color scheme. We see that those calving in this heaviest weight at 30 days of milk in their first lactation are having greater milk production than those calving in their lightest weight at 30 days of milk in their first lactation. So it seems that this effect, there's really no catch-up period. This is all very additive, that these heifers, if they're not given that time to grow during that non-lactating state, they're going to divert that energy we give them in their lactating cow ration to grow and not put all the energy we want towards lactation. So back to this question, do heifers ever catch up? It doesn't seem to be the case. Again, it seems that we have heifers, if we don't give them the opportunity to grow, they're going to take that time during their lactation to grow, which is honestly probably a very costly way to grow heifers rather than growing them before they calve in. So with heifer management considerations, what are our must-dos? How should we manage our heifers that we achieve those growth and do it in an effective manner? And kind of one of the first things I want to say with this is that we need to focus first on quality over quantity. With our increased reproductive performance and the tools that we have, such as sex semen and beef, we're able to really manage our inventory, specifically in our heifers, to really only to reduce the amount of heifers we actually need and really only use keep the heifers, that we find value in. So using tools such as genomic selection to really identify the heifers that we want to stay, to become herd mates and be productive members of the herd. And with those heifers that we determine that we want to keep, that they're genetically elite, we want to be able to implement aggressive growth programs to get them to our target growths. But we also need to know, what is that mature body weight that we want? So going out and weighing third and fourth lactation cows to identify this is what our standard is for maturity in our herd, and this is how we need to grow our heifers to do so. And so with that, measuring our heifer growth to actually determine our average daily grain, have that idea, as well as reduce some incidences of diseases such as scours and pneumonia. We know those can be implicators of how that affects growth in the health of our heifers. And finally, as a reproductive physiologist, I can't not mention repro. And I think a third key aspect of heifer management is aggressive reproductive management. And so once we have those heifers, we have an aggressive growth strategy. We identify that they're at that 55% mature body weight, that we inseminate those heifers quickly. And with that, a quick way to do that is using a protocol such as a 5-day cedar sync protocol. This inseminates all those heifers within that time point. And with this gets back to trying to reduce the costs during that rearing period by having more heifers inseminated, becoming pregnant sooner, and reducing the days on feed. So actually, based on some work from my masters, by using a 5-day cedar sync protocol compared to once daily detection of estrus, it costs $16.66 less per pregnancy when using sex semen. So a really viable option to inseminate heifers quickly after they reach that breeding weight target of about 55% mature body weight. And so with that, I just want to take the time to acknowledge the funding source for some of these projects, the herd that was gracious enough to give us access to their data file, as well as Pete Weber from GenX for creating that connection, helping us through this analysis, as well as Valley Ag Software. And I want to again take the time to thank the extension group here at UW, as well as my PI, Dr. Fricke, Paul, for the opportunity to be able to present some of this work. And I really look forward to any questions that you guys may have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Megan. We do have one question in the chat for you. So the question is, was there a minimum weight or age for first heifer breeding?
That's a great question. So for this herd, this was solely based on age. So the voluntary waiting period for the age in days for this herd was about 380 days. But with this herd, they did have weight data, but not at the time of breeding. So that was kind of a limiting factor.
So the question is do you know of any dairies in the US that use weight alone as a determinant of time of AI? The response that Megan gave is that we are starting to see more herds implement using weight as a marker for breeding eligibility rather than solely just age, but likely the majority of herds in the US are using solely just age. In the US, there is a large opportunity to address in heifer management to increase farm profitability. At this time, we have reached the conclusion of our presentation. Coming up on March 29th, Dr. Paul Fricke will be with us to speak about the randomness of reproduction. This will be our final Badger Dairy Insight, so make sure you are there, that you tune in from 1 p.m. to 2:30 because we know you don't want to miss it. It'll be a fabulous presentation. Thank you all for being here today.